The industrial docks of Incheon were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the air before a huge storm. Kwon Do-shik stood in the middle of a wide, gray parking lot surrounded by tall shipping containers that looked like giant building blocks. This was his kingdom. To the rest of the world, he was a businessman in a sharp black suit with salt and pepper hair, but in these shadows, they called him the Dragon. People knew that if you saw the gold chain against his white shirt or the dark tattoos peeking out from his sleeves, you were either very lucky or in deep trouble. The sun was starting to go down, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum. Everything around Kwon was expensive and cold. 3 large black SUVs sat idling, their engines making a low hum that sounded like a cat purring. His bodyguards, men who looked like they were carved out of stone, stood in their black hats and sunglasses. They didn't move. They didn't talk. They just watched the empty spaces between the buildings. Kwon felt like he was at the top of the world. He had worked for years to make sure everyone in Incheon's industrial heart feared his name and followed his rules. He thought he knew every threat and every enemy. He thought his power made him safe behind a wall of glass and steel. But the silence in the parking lot felt strange today. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was eerie, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. One of his bodyguards pointed toward the edge of the lot, his hand steady but his eyes hidden behind dark lenses. They were alert, but they were looking for big things, other cars, men with weapons, or the police. They weren't looking for something small. That was when the rhythm of the evening broke. A flash of bright pink moved against the gray concrete. It was a little girl, no older than 7, running as fast as her small legs could carry her. She wore a pink hoodie and a beige backpack that bounced against her shoulders as she ran. The bodyguards stepped forward to stop her, their faces hard, but she didn't slow down. She didn't look at their suits or their mean expressions. She only had eyes for Kwon. She burst through the circle of dangerous men like a bird flying through a cage. Kwon frozen as she reached him. She didn't ask for money, and she wasn't crying for help. Instead, she grabbed the sleeve of his expensive suit and pulled him down. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with a secret that was too big for a child to carry. Kwon Do-shik, the man who never showed surprise, felt his heart skip a beat. He knelt down, his hand tattoos visible as he reached out to her. He expected a prank or a mistake. Instead, the girl leaned in and whispered directly into his ear, her voice shaking but determined. "The red light is on your heart," she said. Kwon looked up, his eyes wide with shock. He looked at the girl, then at the empty industrial buildings around them. For the first time in a very long time, the Dragon of Incheon felt a cold shiver of real fear. He realized that while he was busy watching the world from his throne, the world had found a new, invisible way to watch him back. Kwon Do-shik froze as the little girl's words hung in the chilly air. For a second, everything seemed to stop. The hum of the SUV engines felt farther away, and the shadows of the shipping containers seemed to grow longer. He looked into Seo Ara's eyes and saw she wasn't joking. She was truly terrified. Slowly, Kwon looked down at his own chest. There, right over his heart, was a tiny glowing red dot. It was smaller than a ladybug, but it burned bright against the dark fabric of his expensive suit. Kwon's instincts, sharpened by years of surviving the streets, kicked in instantly. He didn't scream or panic. He grabbed Ara by her pink hoodie and pulled her tight against his chest, tucking her small body under his arm to protect her. With a sudden, powerful burst of energy, he threw himself sideways, diving toward the heavy steel tire of the nearest black SUV. "Get down!" he roared at his men. A split second later, a sharp crack echoed through the parking lot. It wasn't the loud boom of a normal gun. It was a high-pitched whistle followed by the sound of shattering glass. The bullet missed Kwon's head by inches, smashing the window of the SUV right where he had been standing just a moment before. Tiny shards of glass rained down like diamonds onto the asphalt. The bodyguards, who usually moved like statues, were suddenly a blur of motion. They drew their weapons, their eyes darting toward the rooftops of the nearby industrial buildings. But there was no one there. No flashes of fire from a rifle, no smoke, and no footsteps. "I don't see a shooter, boss," Nam Jiaite shouted, his voice cracking with shock. He was the bravest enforcer Kwon had, yet he looked completely confused. The red dot was gone, but the danger felt like it was everywhere. Kwon stayed low behind the SUV, his heart thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. He felt Ara trembling in his arms. She was sobbing quietly, her face buried in his shoulder. He realized then that this wasn't just a normal hit. A regular sniper would have been spotted by his men long ago. This was something different, something high-tech that shouldn't exist in a simple dockside turf war. Back in the cars. Now, Kwon commanded. The bodyguards formed a human shield around Kwon and the girl, ushering them into the back of the armored vehicle. As the door slammed shut with a heavy thud, the silence returned to the parking lot, but the peace was gone forever. Kwon looked at the little girl, who was clutching her beige backpack as if it were a life preserver. His men were staring at him, their faces pale and full of questions. They were supposed to be the protectors, yet a 7-year-old girl had saved the dragon of Incheon from an invisible ghost. Kwon touched the gold chain around his neck, his mind racing. He had almost died, and the only reason he was still breathing was because of the bravery of a child. "Who are you, Piccolina?" he asked softly, using a term of endearment he hadn't used in years. Ara looked up, her eyes wet with tears but full of a strange old wisdom. "My name is Ara," she whispered, "and they are coming for everyone." Inside the SUV, the air felt thick and smelled like expensive leather. Kwon Do-shik leaned back against the seat, but his body was still tight with energy. Outside the tinted windows, the industrial docks sped by in a blur of gray and rusty orange. He looked down at the little girl sitting next to him. She looked even smaller now, clutching her beige backpack against her pink hoodie as if it were a shield. Her small hands were shaking, and she kept looking at the floor of the car. Kwon watched her for a long time. He was a man who usually made people tremble just by looking at them. But this girl had run toward him when everyone else was running away. He signaled to his driver to keep circling the city. He needed answers before they reached his safe house. "You saved my life, Ara," Kwon said. His voice was lower and softer than usual, trying not to scare her. "But why me? You could have gone to the police. You could have run to a teacher. Why did you run to a man like me?" Ara looked up. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a spark of courage in them that surprised him. "The police didn't believe my mom," she whispered. "And the teachers said I have a big imagination. But I saw them. I saw the men with the silent cars." Kwon frowned, his tattooed hand resting on his knee. "The silent cars? What do you mean?" "They don't make any noise," Ara explained, her voice getting a little louder as she talked. "They move like shadows. They came to our house 2 weeks ago. My dad works at the docks, and he told me to hide in the closet and not to make a sound. Through the door. I saw them take him. They didn't use guns. They used little flying machines and glowing lights. They called themselves the Ghost Team." Kwon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the car's air conditioning. He had heard rumors of a new group in Incheon, men who used technology like it was magic, but he had ignored them. He thought he was too powerful to be bothered by ghosts. "I saw you on the news once," Ara continued, looking at the gold chain around his neck. "My dad said you were a monster who ruled the docks. He said nobody is braver or meaner than Kwon Do-shik. When I saw the red light on your chest today, I knew they were going to do to you what they did to my dad. I figured, if I needed to stop a monster, I had to find a bigger one to help me." Kwon stared at her. He didn't know whether to be angry or impressed. Most people called him a monster behind his back out of fear. But this child said it to his face because she was hopeful. She didn't want his money or his power, she wanted his strength. He realized that Ara's father was likely one of the many port workers who had gone missing lately. Men Kwon had thought were just quitting their jobs or moving away. "They took him to the big gray buildings by the water," Ara said, her voice trembling again. "I followed them on my bike, but I was too scared to go inside. I saw the red lights there, too. Please, Mr. Monster. You're the only one who isn't afraid of the dark." Kwon looked out the window at the flickering streetlights of Incheon. He thought about his empire and his rules. He had spent his whole life building a wall around himself, but a 7-year-old girl had just climbed right over it. He wasn't just a boss anymore, he was a witness. "I'm not just a monster, Ara," Kwon said, his voice turning as hard as iron. "I'm the one who owns these docks. And nobody takes what belongs to me." He looked at Nam Jiaite in the front seat. "Find out which buildings have been using high-tech security lately. And find out where they are keeping the workers." Ara reached out and touched one of the tattoos on Kwon's hand. It was a dragon, fierce and sharp. For the first time that day, she didn't look like she was about to cry. She looked like she had finally found someone who could fight the ghosts. The black SUV pulled into a hidden garage beneath one of Kwon's private warehouses, the heavy metal door sliding shut with a loud groan that echoed like a giant closing its mouth. Inside the car, the air was still tense. Nam Ji-tae, Kwon's most trusted enforcer, did not wait for the car to fully stop before he jumped out. His face was tight with a mix of anger and confusion. He was a man who knew how to handle knives, handguns, and street brawls. But the invisible attack in the parking lot had left him feeling like a student who had failed a test. Kwon stepped out of the car, still holding Ara's small hand. The girl looked around the dim garage, her eyes wide as she took in the rows of black cars and the men in suits moving quickly to secure the perimeter. Kwon looked at Nam Ji-tae and saw that his enforcer was holding a small plastic bag. Inside the bag was a twisted piece of dark metal and a broken lens that looked like an eye. "I found it, boss," Nam Ji-tae said, his voice sounding rough. It wasn't a man on a roof. It was this. He placed the bag on the hood of the SUV under a bright overhead light. Kwon leaned in to look closer. It didn't look like any toy drone you would see in a park. It was sleek, painted in a flat black color that seemed to soak up the light. And it was small enough to fit in a person's palm. The broken wings were made of a strange, light material that felt like bone, but was stronger than steel. "This is not something you buy in a store," Nam Ji-tae muttered, poking at a tiny circuit board that was still blinking with a faint, ghostly blue light. "I searched the area where the shot came from. There were no footprints, no shell casings, and no smell of gunpowder. This little machine was hovering near the top of a shipping container. It has a built-in silencer and a high-tech laser pointer. It's military-grade, boss. Maybe even better than what the army has." Kwon reached out and touched the broken lens. He realized that Ara had been right about the silent cars and the ghosts. Their enemy, Ma Sang-chul, was moving away from the old ways of the Mafia. He wasn't using tough guys with bats anymore. He was using machines that could kill from a mile away without ever being seen. It was ghost technology, hardware that could bypass every security camera and alarm Kwon had spent millions to install. "It's a machine for cowards," Nam Ji-tae spat, his fist clenching. "How are we supposed to fight something we can't even see until it's too late?" Kwon looked over at Ara, who was standing quietly by the car door. She was watching the blinking blue light on the drone with a look of recognition. "That's the light," she whispered, her voice small but clear in the quiet garage. "That's the same light the men had when they took my dad. They told him he was going to help them build more of these because he was the best at fixing the big cranes at the port." The truth hit Kwon like a physical punch. Ma Sang-chul wasn't just trying to kill him. He was stealing the smartest workers from the docks to build a private army of these drones. The missing men weren't just gone. They were being used as forced labor to create a weapon that would make Ma Sang-chul the king of the entire country. Kwon realized his own power, built on loyalty and physical strength, was becoming obsolete, just like an old computer. "He calls us obsolete hardware," Kwon said, his voice turning cold and sharp. "He thinks he can replace the soul of Incheon with circuit boards and silent motors." Kwon turned to Nam Ji-tae, his eyes glowing with a new kind of fire. "Get the scanners. I want every inch of our territory checked for these signals. If there is a ghost in my machine, I want to find it and rip it out. And find out who is selling this tech to Ma Sang-chul. A syndicate leader doesn't just wake up with military drones. Someone is feeding him." Ara stepped closer to Kwon and reached for his hand again. Her touch was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold metal of the drone on the car hood. Kwon looked down at her and realized that the monster she had come to for help was the only thing standing between these cold machines and the families of the docks. "Don't worry, Ara," Kwon said, his hand tightening around hers. "Ghosts are only scary when you're afraid to look at them. We're going to turn the lights on." Kwon looked at the broken drone one last time before gesturing for his men to move out. The war was no longer about territory or money. It was a war between the heart of the city and the machines that wanted to silence it. And the dragon of Incheon was finally ready to roar. The warehouse remained dim, lit only by the flickering blue light of the broken drone when a shadow moved near the back entrance. Nam Ji-tae reached for his weapon instantly, but Kwon Do-shik raised a hand to stop him. A man stepped forward into the light, raising his hands to show he wasn't holding a gun. He was younger than Kwon, wearing a simple gray jacket and jeans that made him look like just another worker from the docks. "You have a ghost in your garage, Mr. Kwon," the stranger said, his voice calm and steady. But that little machine is just the tip of the iceberg. Nam Jiaite stepped in front of Kwon, his face twisted in a snarl. Who are you? How did you get past my guards? The man didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket slowly and pulled out a small leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge. My name is Jung Haein. I'm an undercover officer with the National Police. And your guards didn't see me because I've been living in these docks for 6 months. Watching Ma Sang-chul's ghosts, just like you are now. Kwon looked at the officer, his eyes narrowing. In his world, a police badge was usually a sign of trouble. But today felt different. The old rules were breaking, and the enemy they faced didn't care about the difference between a criminal and a cop. An officer, Kwon said, his voice like grinding stones. You're a long way from the station, Jung Haein. Why show yourself to a monster like me now? Because Ma Sang-chul is moving faster than we thought, Jung Haein explained, stepping closer to the hood of the SUV. He looked at Ara, who was still clutching Kwon's hand, and his expression softened for a moment. He's not just selling drugs or stealing cars anymore. He's smuggling illegal arms and state-level technology. He's turning Incheon into a laboratory for war. My department wants his head. But he's too well hidden behind his firewalls and his drones. We can't get close. But you know these docks better than anyone. Kwon let out a short, dry laugh. So the police want a mafia boss to do their dirty work? I want to save those fathers, Kwon, the officer said firmly, ignoring the jab. I know about Ara's dad. I know about the other 12 men who were snatched from their homes. They aren't just building drones. They are being used to test them. Ma Sang-chul calls them obsolete. But to us, they are citizens. To her, he's a father. Ara looked at the officer, her eyes searching his face. Do you know where he is? She whispered. Jung Haein nodded sadly. I have a lead, but I can't storm that fortress alone. The police force is slow, and Sang-chul has spies everywhere. If I call for a full raid, he'll kill the witnesses and disappear before the first siren wails. But a monster like you? You can move in the dark. You can hit him where it hurts before he even knows the fight has started. Kwon looked at his tattooed hand, then at the broken drone, and finally at the officer's outstretched hand. It was a strange sight, a high-ranking mafia boss and an undercover cop standing over a piece of forbidden technology in a dark garage. I don't like the police, Kwon said, his voice turning cold. And I don't make deals with people who want to put me in a cage. Then don't think of it as a deal, Jung Haein replied. Think of it as a hunt. You provide the muscle and the local knowledge, and I provide the codes to get past his electronic locks. We take down the syndicate, we save the families, and after that, we can go back to being enemies. But right now, the ghosts are winning. Kwon stayed silent for a long time. He thought about his pride and his history. But then he felt Ara's small fingers tighten around his own. She was the one who had started this war with a single whisper. And she was the one who deserved a world where fathers came home from work. Slowly, Kwon Do-shik reached out his hand. His large, tattooed palm met the officer's steady grip in a firm handshake. It was a pact that would have shocked everyone in Incheon. The dragon and the law, joining forces to fight a shadow. Tell me everything you know about his fortress, Kwon commanded. And Nam Jiaite, get the men ready. We're going to show Ma Sang-chul that some hardware is too tough to break. The black SUV moved slowly through the narrow, bumpy streets of the dockworkers' neighborhood, far away from the bright neon lights of the city center. Kwon Do-shik sat in the back, looking out the window at the tall, crumbling apartment buildings known as the tenements. These were the places where the people who ran his docks went home at night. For years, he had seen these buildings from a distance, but they were always just shapes in the background of his business. Today, with Ara sitting beside him, the shapes were starting to look like homes. The car stopped in front of a building that looked like it was being held together by rust and hope. Trash bins were overflowing, and the streetlights flickered with a weak, dying buzz. Kwon stepped out of the car, his expensive shoes crunching on broken glass. Nam Jiaite and the other bodyguards stood close to him, their eyes sharp as they watched the shadows, but Kwon wasn't looking for snipers this time. He was looking at the faces. In the dim light, he saw women standing in doorways with tired eyes and children playing with sticks in the dirt. When they saw Kwon, the man they knew as the dragon, they didn't cheer or run. They simply lowered their heads or pulled their children closer. It was a silence born of fear, but also of being forgotten. Kwon realized that while he had been counting his gold and expanding his empire, These people had been struggling just to keep the lights on. "This is where my friend lives," Ara whispered, pointing to a dark window on the 3rd floor. "His dad went missing the same night as mine. His mom has to work 3 jobs now, so he stays home alone." Kwon looked at the window and then back at the street. He saw a line of people waiting at a small water pump because the pipes in the building had failed. He saw a grocery store with empty shelves because the prices had gone up too high for a dockworker's pay. His empire was built on the backs of these people. Yet he had allowed the syndicate to creep in and steal their safety right from under his nose. "Why is it so dark here, boss?" Nam Jiaite asked, his voice unusually quiet. He was used to the glitz of the high-end bars and the cold steel of the warehouses. He had never really walked through the shadow docks before. "It's dark because we didn't care enough to bring the light," Kwon replied, his voice sounding heavy. He walked toward a group of men sitting on a bench. They looked up, their faces hard and weathered by the salty sea air. These were the men who moved the cranes and loaded the ships, the hardware that Ma Sang-chul called obsolete. Kwon saw the missing person posters taped to the brick walls, the ink fading from the rain. He saw the faces of the fathers Ara had told him about. For the first time in his life, Kwon didn't feel like a powerful king. He felt like a man who had failed his own family. He had promised protection in exchange for loyalty. But the only thing he had protected was his own profit. He realized that Ma Sang-chul's ghosts had been able to haunt this neighborhood because Kwon had left it in the dark for too long. He turned to Nam Jiaite, his jaw set tight. "I want a list of every family that has lost someone in this neighborhood. I want food brought here tonight. Not just a little, but enough to fill every kitchen. And tell the landlord of these buildings that if the heat and water aren't fixed by tomorrow, I'll find him personally." Kwon looked down at Ara. She was looking at him with those wide, hopeful eyes again. She had called him a monster, but she was the one teaching him how to be a man. He reached out and touched a rusted railing, feeling the cold metal under his hand. He wasn't just here to hunt a rival anymore. He was here to win back the heart of his city. "We aren't just going to find your father, Ara," Kwon promised, loud enough for the men on the bench to hear. "We're going to make sure the shadows don't own this place anymore." As they got back into the car, the people in the doorways didn't look away this time. They watched the black SUV pull away, a small spark of something new appearing in their eyes. It wasn't quite trust yet, but it was a start. Kwon Do-shik sat in the dark car, his mind already moving to the next step. The war was growing, and he finally knew exactly what he was fighting for. The black SUV moved through the fog toward the edge of the harbor, where the old, abandoned factories stood like giant, rusted ghosts. Kwon Do-shik sat in the back with his hands clenched into fists. Behind them, Officer Jung Hae-in followed in a plain car, using a special device to scramble the syndicate's high-tech sensors. They were moving toward a location the officer had tracked, a massive, windowless warehouse that didn't appear on any official maps. When the cars stopped, the air smelled like salt and burnt wires. Kwon stepped out and signaled for Nam Jiaite to bring the heavy gear. Even Ara stayed close, her small face set with a look of bravery that made Kwon's heart ache. They approached a side door that Jung Hae-in opened by tapping a sequence into a glowing tablet. The heavy steel door slid open without a sound, revealing a long, dark hallway lit by flickering blue lights. As they moved deeper into the building, the sound of clicking and whirring grew louder. It wasn't the sound of a normal factory. It was the sound of hundreds of tiny machines working at once. They reached a balcony overlooking the main floor, and what they saw below made even Kwon gasp in horror. The warehouse was a human labor tech farm. Below them, dozens of men in tattered work clothes were seated at long metal benches. These were the missing fathers from the docks. But they weren't just working, they were trapped. Each man had a glowing electronic band around his ankle, tethering him to his station. Above their heads, small drones hovered like angry wasps, watching every move they made. "Look," Ara whispered, her finger trembling as she pointed to a man near the center of the room. "That's Mr. Han from the crane crew. And there. That's my dad." Kwon looked where she pointed. A man with tired, graying hair was hunched over a microscopic circuit board, his hands shaking as he soldered tiny wires. It was the shocking truth Kwon had sensed, but hadn't wanted to believe. Ma Sang-chul wasn't just using machines to replace people. He was forcing the people to build the very machines that would destroy their lives. The fathers were being used as biological tools because their human touch was the only thing precise enough to build the advanced ghost drones. They are building a whole army of them, Nam Jiaite whispered, his eyes wide with rage. He looked at the rows of finished drones, all sleek and black, ready to be sent out into the city. They're using our own people to forge the chains that will bind us. The room was filled with a sad, heavy energy. The men didn't talk to each other. They just worked with their heads down, terrified of the drones hovering above. If a man slowed down, a drone would dip low and emit a sharp, painful sound to force him back to work. It was a cold, heartless system where humans were treated like obsolete hardware that still had a little bit of use left in its hands. Kwon felt a fire rising in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He looked at the fathers, men who had spent their lives working hard to provide for their families, now being treated like prisoners in their own city. He thought about his own empire again, and how he had allowed this evil to grow because he was too busy looking at his own shadow. "We have to get them out," Jung Hae-in said, his voice tight. "But if we just run in there, those drones are programmed to attack the workers first. It's a failsafe. Sang-chul would rather kill the witnesses than let them go." Kwon looked down at Ara, who was staring at her father with tears streaming down her face. She wanted to scream out to him, but she stayed quiet, trusting the monster she had recruited. Kwon realized that a simple gunfight wouldn't work here. They needed to be smarter than the machines. "Nam Jiaite, get the signal jammers," Kwon commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Officer, find a way to kill the power to those ankle bands all at once." "I'm going down there." "Boss, it's too dangerous," Nam Jiaite warned. "There are more guards in the shadows than we can see." "I don't care about the guards," Kwon said, stepping toward the stairs. "I'm going to show these men that the dragon of Incheon hasn't forgotten them. And then, we are going to burn this farm to the ground." Kwon began to descend the stairs, his long coat flowing behind him. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man on a mission to reclaim the soul of the docks. The battle for the fathers had begun, and the ghosts were about to find out what happens when a monster decides to fight for the light. The warehouse was cold, and the sound of the whirring machines filled the air as Kwon Do-shik moved toward the stairs. He felt a new kind of strength in his chest, knowing he was fighting for the families of the docks. But high above on the balcony, something was going wrong. While Kwon was focused on the prisoners below, the shadows behind him began to shift. Nam Jiaite was busy checking the signal jammers when he heard a soft, metallic click. It was the sound of a safety being turned off on a handgun. He turned around quickly, expecting to see a ghost drone, but instead, he saw a familiar face. One of Kwon's own bodyguards, a man named Minho who had served the dragon for 5 years, was pointing his weapon directly at little Ara. "Don't move," Jiaite, Minho said, his voice shaking just a little bit. His eyes weren't cold like a machine, they were full of greed. "Ma Sang-chul offered me more money than I could make in 10 lifetimes with the dragon. He said the old ways are dying, and I don't want to die with them." Ara shrank back, her beige backpack hitting the railing. Her eyes went wide as she looked at the man who was supposed to be her protector. The betrayal felt like a cold wind blowing through the warehouse. Nam Jiaite frozen, his hands raised. He knew that if he reached for his gun, Minho would pull the trigger before he could blink. "Minho, put the gun down," Nam Jiaite pleaded, his voice low and dangerous. "You're selling your soul for circuit boards and dirty cash. Kwon will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "Kwon is obsolete hardware," Minho spat, using the same words the syndicate leader liked to use. "He's a dinosaur watching a meteor fall. Now grab the girl and move toward the exit. Sang-chul wants her as a discarded witness to make sure Kwon stays in line." Down on the main floor, Kwon heard the shouting and looked up. His heart stopped for a second when he saw Minho holding Ara by the arm. The dragon tattoo on Kwon's hand seemed to burn with rage. He had worried about drones and high-tech lasers, but he had forgotten the oldest threat in the world, a man who could be bought. "Minho!" Kwon roared, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "Let her go." But Minho was already dragging Ara toward the side door. He knew the ghost drones were programmed not to hit him as long as he had the girl. He was using a child as a human shield to escape into the night. Ara struggled, her small shoes kicking against the floor, but the man was too strong. Suddenly, a flash of gray moved from the corner of the balcony. Officer Jung Hae-in, who had been hiding in the rafters, dropped down like a shadow. He didn't use a gun, he used a heavy metal pipe he had grabbed from the floor. With a loud clack, he swung the pipe against Minho's arm, sending the handgun flying over the railing and down into the darkness below. Minho yelled in pain and let go of Ara. The girl didn't wait. She scrambled away, crawling under a metal table. Nam Jiaite didn't waste a second. He tackled the traitor, and the two men went crashing into a stack of shipping crates. Kwon raced back up the stairs, his face a mask of pure fury. He reached the balcony just as Jung Hae-in was pulling Ara out from under the table. The girl ran to Kwon and threw her arms around his waist, sobbing with relief. Kwon held her tight, but his eyes were fixed on Minho, who was pinned to the ground by Nam Jiaite. "You chose the wrong side, Minho," Kwon said, his voice so quiet it was scarier than his roar. "You thought money was power, but power is knowing who to trust." Kwon looked at Jung Hae-in and gave a small nod of thanks. The officer nodded back, checking his tablet. The betrayal triggered an alarm, Jung Hae-in warned. "Sangchul knows we're here. He's sending everything he has to lock this place down." The whirring of the drones outside grew louder, sounding like a swarm of angry bees. Kwon looked at the fathers below, who were looking up in terror, and then at the brave little girl by his side. The betrayal had put them in a trap, but it had also ended the time for sneaking around. "Get the fathers ready to move," Kwon commanded. "We aren't hiding anymore. If Sangchul wants a war between his machines and my people, he's going to get one." The lights in the warehouse suddenly turned red, and the heavy doors began to hiss as they locked tight. The final battle for the soul of Incheon had arrived. The warehouse turned into a nightmare of red lights and screaming sirens. The air, which had been cold and still, was suddenly filled with the smell of smoke and hot metal. Ma Sangchul had activated the Inferno protocol, and the factory began to lock down. High above, the ghost drones stopped hovering and began to dive like hungry hawks toward the workers. "Jung Hae-in, get the fathers to the back exit," Kwon Do-shik shouted over the noise. His long coat billowed behind him as he stood at the top of the stairs. "Nam Jiaite, stay with the officer. I'm going for Ara." In the middle of the chaos, the side door burst open. It wasn't just machines this time. A group of tech-enhanced mercenaries stepped into the light. They wore suits that shimmered with strange, moving patterns, making them look like blurry shapes in the smoke. They were the new hardware that Sangchul had promised. They moved with unnatural speed, their eyes glowing with the same ghostly blue light as the drones. Kwon didn't hesitate. He charged down the stairs, his heart pounding like a drum. The first mercenary raised a glowing blade, but Kwon was faster. He used the strength he had built from years on the docks, dodging the strike and delivering a powerful blow that sent the man crashing into a metal workbench. Kwon wasn't fighting for money or territory anymore. He was fighting for the little girl who had called him a monster and believed he could be a hero. "Ara, stay down," Kwon yelled. Ara was huddled behind a heavy steel pillar near the center of the floor. The drones were buzzing all around her, their red lasers searching for a target. One drone dipped low, its weapon humming as it prepared to fire. Kwon grabbed a heavy metal chair and threw it with all his might. The chair smashed into the drone, sending it spinning into a wall where it exploded in a shower of blue sparks. As Kwon reached Ara, 3 more mercenaries blocked his path. They didn't move like men, they moved like programmed robots. One of them kicked Kwon in the chest, sending him skidding across the floor. Kwon felt a sharp pain in his ribs, but he forced himself to stand up. He looked at his tattooed hands, now covered in grease and dust, and realized that his old strength came from something these machines didn't have: love and a promise. He fought through the gauntlet with a fury that the mercenaries couldn't understand. He used the shipping crates as shields and the tools of the dockworkers as weapons. He was a whirlwind of motion, breaking through the high-tech armor of his enemies with raw, human power. Finally, he reached the pillar and scooped Ara up into his arms. "I've got you," he whispered, tucking her head against his chest, just like he had in the parking lot. "I'm not letting go." But the warehouse was becoming an oven. Fire began to lick at the stacks of drone parts, and the ceiling started to groan. At the far end of the room, Ma Sangchul appeared on a high glass balcony, looking down at the mess below. He held a remote control in his hand, his face twisted in a cold smile. "You're fighting for a dead world." "Kwon," Sangchul's voice boomed through the speakers. "The fathers are gone, the girl is a ghost, and you are just a memory." Sangchul pressed a button, and the floor near the exit began to collapse. A wall of fire rose up, cutting off the path where the fathers and the officer were trying to escape. Ara let out a small cry of terror as she saw her father trapped on the other side of the flames. Kwon looked at the fire, and then up at Sang-chul. He knew he couldn't fight the fire with a gun or a knife. He looked at the heavy crane controls hanging from the ceiling nearby. It was old equipment, the kind he had used when he first started working at the docks as a young man. "Ara, hold on to my neck," Kwon commanded. He ran toward the controls, dodging one last drone. With a roar of effort, he jumped and grabbed the heavy iron lever. He pulled it down with all his weight. With a loud, rusty screech, the giant crane arm above the warehouse floor began to swing. It smashed through the glass balcony where Sang-chul stood, sending the syndicate leader diving for cover. More importantly, the heavy hook of the crane smashed through the roof, creating a hole that allowed the smoke to escape and the cool night air to rush in. The impact also knocked over a massive water tank. Millions of gallons of water crashed down, dousing the flames and creating a wet, foggy path for the fathers to run toward. "Go! Now!" Kwon yelled to the men. The fathers, led by Jung Hae-in and Nam Ji-ae, sprinted through the gap. Ara's father paused for a split second, looking at his daughter in the arms of the dragon. Kwon gave him a firm nod, a silent promise that the nightmare was almost over. Kwon carried Ara through the steam and the wreckage of the ghost machines. He was exhausted, his suit was ruined, and his body was bruised. But as he stepped out into the cool Incheon night, he felt lighter than he had in years. The warehouse inferno was behind them, and for the first time, the ghosts were the ones who were afraid of the dark. The cool night air of Incheon felt clean and fresh after the smoke and heat of the warehouse. Kwon Do-shik stood on the damp pavement, his ruined suit jacket draped over his arm. All around him, the silence of the docks was broken by the sound of heavy breathing and the distant sirens of the police backup that Officer Jung Hae-in had finally called in. The ghost syndicate was finished. Ma Sang-chul had been captured while trying to crawl away through the wreckage, his high-tech remotes broken and useless. Kwon looked down at Ara, who was still holding his hand. Her pink hoodie was covered in dust, but her eyes were bright. A few feet away, a group of tired men stood together. They looked like they had just woken up from a long, terrible dream. One man stepped forward, his eyes searching the crowd until they landed on the little girl. "Ara?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Ara let go of Kwon's hand and sprinted across the concrete. "Daddy!" she cried. She jumped into her father's arms, and he swung her around, crying into her shoulder. The other fathers were meeting their own families who had rushed to the scene as word spread through the tenements. It was a sight that the cold machines of the syndicate could never understand. Kwon watched the reunion from the shadows, a small, tired smile on his face. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Jung Hae-in. The officer looked exhausted, but he didn't look at Kwon like a criminal anymore. "You did a good thing tonight, Kwon," Jung Hae-in said. "The city won't forget that the dragon fought for them. But things have to change now. The old ways of ruling through fear are what let Sang-chul move in. If you leave people in the dark, they will always look for someone to turn the lights on, even if that person is a ghost." Kwon nodded slowly. He looked at his tattooed hands and the gold chain around his neck. For 20 years, he had been a king of shadows. But he realized that a true king doesn't just own the land. He protects the people who live on it. He thought about the crumbling tenements and the hungry children he had seen in the shadow docks. "My business is changing, officer," Kwon said, his voice firm and steady. "The docks don't need a monster anymore. They need a guardian." In the weeks that followed, the city of Incheon watched a transformation they never expected. The ghost technology was taken away by the government, but the real change happened on the ground. Kwon used his vast wealth to fix the tenements. The rusty pipes were replaced. The streetlights were turned back on, and the shadow docks became a place where people could walk safely at night. He set up a special fund for the families of the workers, ensuring that no child would ever have to go to a monster for help because their parents couldn't afford medicine or food. Nam Ji-ae and the rest of his men stopped carrying weapons and started patrolling the streets as protectors, making sure that no new syndicate could ever take root in the soil of Incheon again. One sunny afternoon, Kwon stood by the harbor, watching the big cranes move cargo under a bright blue sky. He heard a familiar sound of running feet and turned to see Ara. She wasn't wearing her pink hoodie today. She had a bright yellow one, and she looked happy and healthy. Her father walked behind her, nodding respectfully to Kwon as they passed. Ara ran up to Kwon and gave him a quick hug before holding up a drawing. It was a picture of a large, friendly dragon standing over a small house. "Thank you, Mr. Dragon," she said with a wide smile. Kwon watched her run back to her father. He wasn't the feared ghost of the docks anymore, and he wasn't just a boss. He had become a new kind of king, one who understood that his power was only as strong as the safety of the smallest child in his kingdom. The dragon of Incheon had finally found his soul, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of what the light might show. The war was over, and the city was finally awake.